the topic tonight of U.S.-Russia relations, how do they get so bad, and what can be done about it, is a terrific title, for which we thank you. It certainly is comprehensive. There's so many fundamental questions are lodged within that, both in terms of the present and the future, and certainly implies an interest in the analytic. So we're certainly delighted with that. And of course, our guest has been a student of these things for a quarter of a century or so. His first book had to do with leadership in Russian foreign policy from Stalin through Gorbachev. Then he wrote a book on the NATO decision to enlarge. This is huge. And then on the relations after the end of the Cold War, and then on America between the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11. All very interesting topics, of course, all of which have emerged as books. And of course, numerous monographs and shorter statements have been made on those topics. I remind you of that just to underline the value of what we will probably hear this evening. The Professor Goldgeier also is a member of a variety of organizations, which are including fellowships at most of Washington's think tanks. In short, he knows the intellectual community in international affairs. And further, he had enjoyed some practical experiences both at state and the National Security Council. So he brings an extraordinary background in terms of substance to this evening. I should also note that he's interested in the joining of theory, international relations theory, to practical politics as part of an academic effort, started, of course, by a very interesting and important figure, Alexander George, a noted political scientist of a number of years ago. The preparation is huge. His academic career is known to most of you, graduate of Harvard, MA and Ph.D. from the University of California, Berkeley, taught at Cornell for a period of time, went to George Washington for 17 or 18 years, and then a half a dozen years ago or so, went to American University as dean of their program for international service. It's a very distinguished academic career. It's marvelously rooted in serious attention to the topic of this evening. It's an enormous pleasure. And I should mention one other thing. He's a native of Baltimore. And a number of you will have known his deceased mother, who taught at Roland Park Country School for a number of years. So it's my great pleasure to present you, and Professor Goldgeier.
Well, Frank, thank you so much. It's always such a treat to be back in Baltimore, and had a chance to visit with some family today, so that was very nice. And sorry to take you away from I know it's preferable to be looking out that way. I do appreciate that you turned around. But I also said to Frank, you know, that I've been here multiple times, and always thrilled to be here. And just the number of people who come to these events. I've been to World Affairs Council all over this country, and well, this is the best World Affairs Council in the United States. There's no question about it. So, all right. So how did things get this bad in the U.S.-Russia relationship, and what can we do about it? I think actually the first part's pretty easy to identify, but very much worth talking through. And as for the second, not much anytime soon, but it's certainly worth talking about. So I think it's important when we look at the U.S.-Russia relationship to really think about the dynamics really going back 60 years or more. I mean, you go back to Nikita Khrushchev's rise to power in the late 1950s, and a fundamental Soviet and then Russian view has been to be viewed as an equal to the United States. During that same period, the United States' goal has been to maintain its status as the world's leading power. So you see the problem. There's an incompatibility between those two objectives, and that has been a central defining feature in the US-Russian relationship during that time. Soviet and Russian leaders have fought back against efforts to diminish Russia's standing and influence, and at the same time, they've worked to undermine what they see as American hegemony. During the Cold War, the two sides managed in the late 60s and early 70s to work out a way to regulate their rivalry, the policy known as détente. It appeared that the Soviet Union had finally achieved equal status with the United States, codified in the arms control agreements of that time. Any sense that the United States had been on a decline and the Soviets rising in the 60s, 70s was reversed in the early 1980s, and then, of course, by the late 80s, the Soviets were trying to hang on to their post-World War II acquisitions. And then you had the collapse of the USSR, what Vladimir Putin called the greatest geostrategic catastrophe of the 20th century. And, you know, there were some really major geostrategic catastrophes of the 20th century. But that certainly left Russia in a weak position and a dominant United States able to set the global agenda. Got to remember back to those days. In the 2000s, we've seen a United States that's been sort of grappling with the need to manage its relative decline, a decline from its position in the 1990s, due in part to America's own domestic and foreign policy blunders, and in part due to the rise of others, and especially China. While Russia under Putin, although still weak across many traditional indicators, is playing a more significant global role. Now, striking is that the US-Russia relationship has not been this bad since probably the immediate aftermath of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And with the recent decision by the Trump administration to walk away from the Reagan-era Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the prospects for a turnaround are exceedingly dim. So what I want to do is walk through first the relationship prior to Putin, the relationship in the 90s, because I think it's really important to understand that there were such high hopes for a good US-Russian relationship in the 1990s. But I want to note that those hopes were based on US dominance and Russian weakness. And then I want to turn to the dramatic downturn in the relations that emerged during the past decade, and then ask what, if anything, can be done about it. As I said, not much, but I'll get to that. So the 1990s. Really can't understand them in isolation, really have to think about them in the context of Russia's rise and fall as a great power. Go back to Khrushchev, the decision to deploy the missiles in Cuba, which was done because he was angry about the US missiles that were deployed in Turkey and Italy. And of course, he had to back down during the missile crisis. The Soviet Union then embarked on a major nuclear arms buildup, so that would never happen again. And you had this 1972, 1973 era of sort of nuclear parity and arms control, with the Soviets being treated as an equal. Now, Reagan came into office elected in 1981, comes into office determined to reverse what he saw as America losing in the face of this Soviet Union. He was an opponent of détente, and his strategy was to rebuild US capabilities in order to reassert the US position in the world. But he also believed in the need to engage in diplomatic outreach, and the more documents we see, the more we realize how eager he was for diplomatic outreach from the beginning of his presidency. And he was enabled in the ascension in spring of 1985 by Mikhail Gorbachev becoming General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, someone who was seeking to do something about the domestic situation in the Soviet Union and needed a better relationship with the United States to focus on it. And then Yeltsin emerges, stands on the tank in 1991, emerges as the leader, undisputed leader after Gorbachev and after the Soviet Union's collapse, with a strategy to be even more pro-Western than Gorbachev was as part of their domestic political battle. But even then, even with his focus on being pro-Western, he was extremely mindful of the desire by Russians to have their country viewed as an equal to the United States, even in that moment. I want to spend a little time going through some documents that have recently been declassified and posted by the Clinton Presidential Library. They've declassified the records of nearly all of the Clinton-Yeltsin meetings and phone calls from January 23rd, 1993 to December 31st, 1999, when Yeltsin stepped down and Putin became acting president. It's about 1,000 pages, so I read them for you, and I had three main takeaways from reading through this document that I think really help us understand not only that period, but how we got from there, which was hopeful, to where we are now, which is not. So first of all, you had two leaders who really established a very close personal rapport. I mean, they met a lot, they talked a lot. I think there were 18 meetings that were for which we have the notes, and I think 55 phone calls during that period. And they really used that relationship to get through some very difficult disagreements, the most serious of which were over NATO enlargement and the Kosovo War. And throughout, from 1993, when Yeltsin was battling his parliament and there was, he was using force against the parliament in Moscow, through his re-election campaign, through the 1998 Russian financial crisis, Bill Clinton provided full unconditional support for Yeltsin as he faced one crisis after another. Second, the two men used their meetings and phone calls to build trust in one another, which I think is important. Keep that in mind when we get to the Putin-Obama period. And I was in government at the time. I was really struck when in their phone calls that each successive call, they would refer back to what they had promised the other in a previous call and then make sure to tell the other that they had done what they had said they would do. And this would prove particularly important in the discussions over NATO enlargement that I'll come back to in a moment. And then third, and I think really the most important when we look at the Clinton-Yeltsin relationship, is that compared to other U.S.-Soviet or U.S.-Russian leaders, this period, the power imbalance is just quite noticeable when you look at the conversations. Yeltsin-Russia was, of course, extremely weak. It had gone through an economic collapse. It was in strategic decline, and the United States, meanwhile, was enjoying its unipolar moment. And in no other era before or since has the Russian president been in such a weak position when meeting with his American counterpart. And we see how that plays out in these declassified records. The meetings largely consist of Yeltsin agreeing to Clinton's requests after some back and forth. But even in that most unequal period, you still see Yeltsin's desire to be seen as an equal, for Russia to be seen as an equal. Just as it was important for Khrushchev, for Brezhnev, for Gorbachev, for Yeltsin, as it is for Putin. So let me talk briefly about sort of these three different elements. First of all, the support, tremendous support, and not just financial, although the financial support that the United States provided was critical, including when Clinton publicly endorsed what became a $10.2 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund that was announced in the middle of the 1996 Russian presidential campaign. I'd be happy to come back to that issue of U.S. involvement in the 1996 Russian campaign. Clinton offered Yeltsin complete support when Yeltsin used force against the Russian parliament in the fall of 1993. And he did so because he believed he needed this friendly Russian leader to turn Russia from a former enemy into a friend so that Clinton could concentrate on what he cared the most about, which was his domestic programs. Clinton saw Yeltsin as a significant figure in Russian history, and he tried to convey that at various points. At a meeting in May '98, Clinton said, Boris, and I'm really sorry, I used to do a great Clinton accent, but I can't do it anymore. Boris, we really are working with the stuff of history here. I'm convinced that 20 years from now, when the Russian economy is booming, people will look back and say, we were right, we did the right things. I just hope you get all the credit you deserve while you're still around, because you've done a terrific job leading your country during one of the 2 or 3 most important moments in Russian history. That is not the way Russians would view that period. Now, the greatest test of their relationship was actually not over NATO enlargement, as many think, and I will talk about enlargement in a second because it permeates so much of what's come after, but it was really over the Kosovo War. This was, when you read these documents, you just see. Clinton and his European counterparts believed they needed to conduct airstrikes against Serbia for what it was doing in Kosovo, and the Russians really opposed this, not just because of the close ties between Russia and Serbia, but also because it was interference in the affairs of a sovereign country, and Russia was very sensitive to that. Russia would have vetoed any kind of any kind of resolution at the UN Security Council, so Clinton didn't go through the UN Security Council and did it as a NATO operation. As NATO was about to launch airstrikes, their conversation went as follows. Clinton, rehashed all that Milosevic had done and then said to Yeltsin, basically, it will be your decision if you decide to let this bully destroy the relationship we worked hard for over 6.5 years to build up. You may decide to let this get in the way of our relationship, but I'm not going to, because I don't think he's that important. I'm sorry he's a Serb. I wish he were Irish or something else, but he's not. Yeltsin would have none of it. Our people will certainly from now have a bad attitude with regard to America and with NATO. I remember how difficult it was for me to try and turn the heads of our people, the heads of the politicians toward the West, towards the United States. But I succeeded in doing that. And now, to lose all that? Well, since I failed to convince the president, that means there is in store for us a very difficult road of contacts if they prove to be possible. I think the United States and the West in general really underestimated how important this war was on the perception of Russia, on the Russian perceptions of the United States and its allies. The United States did bypass the UN Security Council, and it was a precursor to the decision George W. Bush made 4 years later to bypass the Security Council in going to war with Iraq. And remember, one way Russia maintains its equal status to the United States, one of the few ways, is by both having permanent membership on the UN Security Council. So if you just ignore that, if the United States just ignores that by Russia, and of course we could talk about Russia then going into Ukraine in 2014, but in these cases, the United States went to war in both cases over Russia's objections. NATO enlargement. I think it's really the most fascinating issue for providing a window into this relationship in the 90s and would become so important later. And basically, an undercurrent of all their exchanges was Clinton's desire or his efforts to try to convince Yeltsin that he was really trying to not harm Yeltsin politically, even though he was doing something that Yeltsin was clear was very difficult for him. Yeltsin constantly explained how difficult this was, even though at the end of the day he kept going along with Clinton's proposals. And this huge power imbalance is really central to this relationship. And again, keep this in mind as we come fast forward later to Georgia and Ukraine. So Clinton really drove the agenda in these meetings. The United States was really calling the shots. Clinton was always trying to make sure that Yeltsin knew he was giving him what he could. Clinton expected Yeltsin to go along with the proposals, which he did. Clinton, in first telling Yeltsin that this was going to be happening in September of '94, tried to make sure Yeltsin understood nothing concrete was going to happen before June of 1996, when Yeltsin had his re-election. Yeltsin continued to try to focus Clinton's attention on the domestic political ramifications of enlargement. So September '94, this is what Clinton said to Yeltsin. We're going to move forward on this, but I'd never spring it on you. There'll be no surprises, no rush, no exclusion. As I see it, NATO expansion is not anti-Russia. I don't want you to believe I wake up every morning thinking only about how to make the Warsaw Pact countries a part of NATO. It's not the way I look at it. What I do think about is how to use NATO expansion to advance the broader, higher goal of European security, unity, and integration, a goal I know you share. He emphasized that no exclusion meant Russia could join NATO someday, which was true theoretically, but was never going to be true in practice. And Clinton continued to try to show Yeltsin that he understood it was hard, but he was going forward anyway. May of '95, Clinton was heading to Moscow for a celebration of the end of World War II anniversary events, and Clinton called Yeltsin to discuss it. We recognize how sensitive this issue is for you. That's why I want to assure you that this process is proceeding along a path that's consistent with what you and I agreed upon last September, and that Vice President Gore reiterated when he saw you in December. Yeltsin said, I fully agree with you on that. Clinton added, for the future stability of Europe, it's important that Russia is a vital part of the new security structures that are emerging. None of this can develop normally unless Russia is involved in the process. The issue remained an enormous sore spot. When they met in the Kremlin on May 10th, 1995, Yeltsin asked for a better understanding of what Clinton was doing. Because now I see nothing but humiliation for Russia if you proceed. How do you think it looks to us if one bloc continues to exist while the Warsaw Pact has been abolished? He called it a new form of encirclement. You and I are heading for elections, Yeltsin said. The extremists and hardliners are exploiting this issue for their own purposes on both sides. I'm being attacked from both the right and the left on this. We need a common European space that provides for overall security. So let's postpone any change in NATO until 1999 or 2000. But for me to agree to the borders of NATO expanding toward those of Russia, that would constitute a betrayal on my part of the Russian people. Instead, Yeltsin said in desperation, let's say that Russia will give every state that wants to join NATO a guarantee that we won't infringe on its security. Clinton asked rhetorically whether the United States still needed to maintain a security relationship with Europe, and Yeltsin said, I'm not so sure you do. Clinton then said, look, our goal, he tied it to the history of the Victory Day ceremony for which he'd come to Moscow. Our goal is for the U.S. to stay in Europe and promote a unified, integrated Europe. And he explained how he thought he was doing this through the various things that NATO and Russia were doing together, reminded Yeltsin again that he was going slowly because he didn't want to do anything until after the first half of 1996. And Yeltsin said, that's good because my position heading into the 1996 elections is not exactly brilliant. Clinton had explained to Yeltsin that he had his own political concerns, which was that Republicans were using NATO expansion in their effort to win over voters of Central and Eastern European descent in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ohio. So here's what I want to do, said Clinton. I've made it clear I'll do nothing to accelerate NATO. I'm trying to give you now, in this conversation, the reassurance you need. But we need to be careful that neither of us appears to capitulate. For you, that means you're not going to embrace expansion. For me, it means no talk about slowing the process down or putting it on hold or anything like that. So 1997, as NATO was as they were about to announce that new members were coming in, Yeltsin made one last attempt. Our position hasn't changed, he said. It remains a mistake for NATO to move eastward, but I need to take steps to alleviate the negative consequences of this for Russia. I am prepared to enter into an agreement with NATO, not because I want to, but because it is a forced step. There is no other solution for today. And then he put on the table what he most wanted. One thing is very important. Enlargement should also not embrace the former Soviet republics. I cannot sign any agreement without such language, especially Ukraine. He knew he probably wasn't going to get it, so he tried again. I propose in the statement we accept the fact that Russia has no claims on other countries. In fact, regarding the countries of the former Soviet Union, let's have a verbal gentleman's agreement. We wouldn't write it down in the statement. No former Soviet republics would enter NATO. This gentleman's agreement would not be made public. Clinton explained why he couldn't do that. It'd be a bad thing for our attempt to build a new NATO, but it would also be a bad thing for your attempt to build a new Russia. He said to Yeltsin, Russia would be saying, we've still got an empire, it just can't reach as far west. And Clinton didn't want to come out of that meeting having agreed to new lines being drawn in Europe. Yeltsin was desperate. He asked Clinton to tell him what he wanted to hear, quote, one-on-one, without even our closest aides present, that you won't take new republics in the near future. I need to hear that. Clinton said, if I went into a closet with you and told you that, the Congress would find out and pass a resolution invalidating the NATO-Russia Charter. A private commitment would be the same as a public one. I know what a terrible problem this is for you, but I can't make the commitment you are asking for. So Yeltsin's desire to be seen as an equal, Clinton's efforts to provide window dressing to help with appearances really also permeated the conversations throughout the two presidents' time in office, and not only during their conversations over NATO enlargement. And the problem was that they just occupied two very different spaces in the international system. The United States was dominant, and the Russians were very weak. And there was one moment where, in that May 95 meeting with in Moscow, Clinton said to Yeltsin, you have to walk through the doors that we opened for you. You have to walk through the doors that we opened for you. Well, you know, that's not being treated as an equal. So it's interesting. You know, when I read all those memcons and telcons of the 7 years of interactions, I actually really came away feeling quite sad. You know, they accomplished a lot, especially in their first terms. You know, the Russian troops left the Baltics. Yeltsin was able to get Russian enterprises to stop transferring missile technologies to Iran. They worked together on Bosnia, and Russia participated in the implementation force there. They worked together with their counterparts in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine to remove the nuclear weapons, the strategic nuclear weapons that had been on those countries' soil after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I really felt like, you know, most of the accomplishments were really sort of cleaning up the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They had lots of plans for like new arms control agreements and so on, and they just had enormous domestic political constraints on both sides. And they never found both sides. This is what I always say to people who really are angry with the United States for something like NATO enlargement. Neither side figured out a way for Russia to have a place in European security. And it also meant that for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, they were really destined for insecurity. On December 31st, 1999, Clinton called Yeltsin just after Yeltsin's announcement that he was stepping down in favor of Putin, who of course went on to win the presidential election a few months later. And in their final call, Clinton said, you have guided your country through a historic time, and you are leaving a legacy that will leave Russians better off for years to come. Boris, I believe that historians will say you were the father of Russian democracy. Not yet, anyway. All right, Putin. So Putin comes to power, and his initial objectives were mainly defensive, to try to prevent further Western encroachment into what he considers to be Russia's privileged sphere of influence, the former Soviet Union, and his goal of trying to rebuild Russia as a great power in world politics after what he viewed as the calamity of the 1990s. He's not the only Russian to view it that way. And over time, his goals really expanded to include undermining Western unity, which is not a big surprise. It's something the Soviet Union tried to do all throughout the Cold War. So it's not a new thing. Now, meanwhile, the United States undermined its own global standing and legitimacy as the world's leading power by going to war with Iraq in 2003 and then creating a global financial crisis in 2008. And Russia, disillusioned, began to push back against the United States. Coming just 4 years after NATO's bombing campaign in the Balkans, that in Moscow's view encroached on Russia's interests, Putin was enraged at what he saw as the US effort to unilaterally force its will on the rest of the world when the Bush administration decided to go to war without UN Security Council authorization. Of course, America's standing took a big hit, not just with Russia, but globally, when the war in Iraq turned into a quagmire, when the photos were released of Abu Ghraib. The Europeans were arguing that the United States should close the facility at Guantanamo Bay, and the United States, through both the incompetence of the occupation of Iraq and the waterboarding, lost its tremendous credibility. Putin was also angry at the ties between Western institutions like the U.S. Agency for International Development and domestic civil society that he viewed as having fostered the so-called color revolutions that ousted pro-Russian governments in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan from 2003 to 2005. And he really believed that the United States had designs on regime change in Russia itself. At the 2007 Munich Conference on Security Policy, Putin made clear his unhappiness with U.S. global dominance, arguing that a unipolar world, quote, a world in which there is one master, one sovereign, is pernicious, not only for all those within this system, but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys itself from within. Interesting point. And he expressed particular ire for NATO. I think it's obvious that NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? Now, the Bush administration, despite Iraq, despite the financial, was still going full bore on trying to reach out to former Soviet countries in order to draw them closer to NATO, and in particular Georgia and Ukraine, and worked very hard at the 2008 Bucharest summit to convince allies to offer what are called membership action plans to those two, which did not happen. But they did get in the summit declaration the statement that Ukraine and Georgia would become NATO members someday. And of course, in August of that year, Russia went to war with Georgia, recognized two breakaway provinces, and Putin, I think, was trying to make clear that there was a red line that he thought the West should not cross. Now, you may remember he became prime minister and then he returned to the Russian presidency in 2012, and he was obsessed with what he believed was an effort to foster regime change in Russia. He blamed the United States and Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Clinton in particular, for fomenting street protests during the Russian parliamentary elections in 2011. But, you know, Putin was now dealing with a U.S. president who had been seeking a reset with Russia amid a broader effort to emulate the realism of George H.W. Bush rather than the expansive internationalism of his son. And Barack Obama had made very clear in his first year in office, NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia was off the table. And relations in that first term, Obama's first term, Putin's term as prime minister, when he was still in charge, the relationship was much improved. But then the relationship begins to spiral. You have the Putin reaction to the street protest, and then in 2013, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, who was a Putin ally, was trying to see what he could get from both the European Union and Russia and trying to play one off against the other, and got a little too fancy. Street protests toppled him from power, and of course the Russians then invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and supported the civil war that's taking place in eastern Ukraine. And so by 2014, the United States was refocused with its allies on containing Russia, just as it had been during the Cold War. The West imposed the economic sanctions on elites who were close to Putin. NATO began increasing its capabilities in the East, stepping up air and sea patrols in the Baltic and Black Sea regions. And there is a danger, as you may have seen in the last couple days, of when the West and Russian air patrols get too close to one another, and then deploying troops on a rotating basis to the territory of NATO's eastern members. Now, Trump's election in 2016. I think one of the most fascinating things about the Trump election is the turnabout within the Republican Party on Russia. Do remember, during the Cold War, I mean, it was anti-communism that was the glue that held the Republican Party together. And the Republicans used to criticize the Democrats for being too weak to stand up to U.S. interests in the face of the threat from Moscow. Conservative Republicans saw it to their advantage to criticize not just Democrats, but members of their own party for showing any signs of appeasement of Moscow. We think of Reagan's victory over Carter as an attack on the Democrats. He had already started in '76 attacking Ford and moderate Republicans for the détente policy. And then when he was in office, even he wasn't immune to such critiques. As he prepared to meet with Gorbachev for the first time in November 1985, who was out in front leading the charge against him? Republican Congressman Newt Gingrich, who called that meeting, quote, the most dangerous summit for the West since Adolf Hitler met with Neville Chamberlain in 1938 in Munich. Reagan, Gorbachev, Chamberlain, Hitler. Now, you know, Trump's public praise for Putin as being strong and being tough is, again, you know, remarkable for a Republican president. And most GOP voters and the GOP elites have really shrugged this off. It's hard to imagine that if any of the other Republicans who had been running in 2016, if they had won, that they would be this accommodating on Russia. But Trump is, and that is where his party is going. Now, some in the conservative movement have admired Putin's willingness to stand up for what they would see as traditional values, but it really doesn't explain why other Republicans, particularly in Congress, have stayed so quiet. Senate Majority Leader McConnell, House Speaker Ryan, I mean, they've tried to steer as far from this as possible. Vice President Pence, outgoing ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, have also tried to distance themselves. But, you know, there was a fear of antagonizing the base prior to yesterday's midterm elections. The interesting thing, there's not only a disconnect between sort of the new Republican Party under Trump and what we saw from Eisenhower to Romney, but there's also a disconnect between Trump and the U.S. policy. If you look at U.S. policy, the basics remain unchanged. The United States still has its troops stationed in Europe, maintains a strong presence in Eastern Europe, has in fact upped that presence in Eastern Europe, and the United States continues to maintain the sanctions regime over Ukraine. And partly that reflects Trump's weakness on being able to shape Russian policy. You remember how much he was criticized in July when he met with Putin and, you know, was seen as if he were Putin's puppet. And anytime he would want to reach out and do something to create a more cooperative U.S.-Russian relationship, he's going to be accused of doing it because Putin helped him win the election in 2016. He doesn't want a conversation about that. So what are we likely to see? I don't think much is going to change for the better anytime soon. And in fact, the new chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, will start holding hearings in January on Russia's election interference. Now, if I had come here in September, I would have said the best place to start rejuvenating, reviving the U.S.-Russian relationship would be on arms control. It's a great issue for Russia because they're one of the two superpowers, so you get that equality, and it's in the U.S. interests. And, you know, Russia's been violating the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty for a while. The thought was that the United States would push them into a renegotiation of that treaty, and the other was to extend the New START treaty for 5 years after it expires in 2021. But we have a national security advisor, John Bolton, who despises treaties and arms control agreements and seems to have Trump's ear on these issues. So I think a relationship that's arguably as bad as it's ever been shows little sign of positive movement. Arms control was the obvious place to rebuild the U.S.-Russian relationship, but that's not happening. But on the other hand, there doesn't seem to be anywhere this relationship could go other than up. And so, since that's a positive, I'm going to end there and look forward to your questions. Thank you. So the question was, am I a fan of the sanctions? So it's a really interesting thing now in U.S. foreign policy, the issue of sanctions, because it's really, especially since Iraq, it's really become sort of the go-to, right? Okay, well, gosh, we don't have to use military force. We could just coerce other people by using sanctions. This seems a lot friendlier and a lot less detrimental. We're not going to get our soldiers killed. So the thing about sanctions is, and you know, they did work in the case of Iran on the nuclear weapons. You can criticize that deal on it didn't stop all of Iran's other behavior, and that was the critique that Trump had coming in. It's a legitimate critique. But Iran did decide to stop moving forward, at least for the period covered by the treaty, by the deal. It wasn't a treaty, by the deal, for, you know, agreed not to move forward on the program in exchange for relief from the sanctions. But that's the thing about sanctions. If you put them on, whoever you're putting them on has to think there's something they could do to get them off. And you also have to have a theory about why they would work. So the theory in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, putting the sanctions on Russia, the theory was, we're going to put sanctions on people close to Putin, and it's going to hurt. So they're going to go to Putin, and they're going to say, boss, you gotta do something about this. You know, we're losing our real estate. Kids can't go to school in the West anymore. I mean, you gotta do something. They didn't, right? Because he takes care of them. So they didn't really. It certainly had an impact on the Russian economy, but he's able to ride through that. And then the question is, what would it take for him to get the sanctions relief? And there are different sanctions over different things. The real question is, could he get enough relief if he was able to come to some agreement on the civil war that's taking place in eastern Ukraine? Because if he has to leave Crimea to get the relief, he's not leaving Crimea. So he has to really try to calculate what would be necessary for him to do. And I think that's the real issue with sanctions. If you're going to put them on, you have to make very clear to the other side what they need to do, and it has to be something they would do. There was all that talk in 2014 about an exit ramp. You know, he could choose the exit ramp. But him leaving Crimea is a non-starter. So the question was, you had a previous speaker who talked about the fact that our foreign policy was driving Russia and China together, and you know, how are we doing that? Why are we doing that? So Russia, I mean, it's a very interesting global situation. And probably more interesting than the 90s. The 90s were kind of boring. The United States was dominant, you know, could do whatever it wanted, could boss everybody around. It's more interesting when you can't boss everybody around. So, and the United States has made clear that it looks at strategic competition with China and with Russia as a threat to the United States. And of course, Iran, the United States also has a difficult relationship with Iran. One of the big things for the United States is not to, these are three very different countries. But the one thing they all have in common is they can't stand the United States going around telling everybody else what to do. And they don't want the United States driving the global agenda. They want to be able to, they all have things they want to be able to do in their region. They want to be able to have influence in their region, and they don't want the United States to be countering that. So China and Russia have both complained for a long time about American hegemony. And, you know, especially, I mean, Iraq was really it wasn't just a big thing here. It was a big thing throughout the world because it was the United States basically saying, well, we think they have weapons of mass destruction, and we're going to go in and we're going to do something about it. And when they didn't have the weapons of mass destruction, then that really intensified the challenge, exacerbated the problem. But you have China and Russia, again, permanent members of the Security Council. If the United States is going to go to war without asking for UN Security Council authorization, and they can't stop it, that's damaging to their power. So then the question is, can they come together to forge some kind of alliance against the United States? And it's actually pretty hard. They have a pretty transactional relationship, energy relationship largely, Russian energy, Chinese needs a lot of energy in order to fund for their economy, but there are limits to that Russia-China relationship. They've got their own set of conflicts. Russia is nervous about China's rise. You know, Russia didn't want to be a junior partner to the United States. Doesn't really want to be a junior partner to China either, right? China, has things it wants from Russia. China also wants greater influence in Central Asia, which is where they clash. So I think, there are ways that they can forge specific agreements, but on a real sort of Russia-China alliance against the United States, I think that's very difficult for them to pursue. Your question raises a really important point, which is, when we talk about a country as a great power, what do we mean? What kind of capacity do they have? Right? We look at China because China now is the #2 economy in the world. It's growing. There's talk about when, as an overall economy, it would overtake the United States, even though per capita it'll still remain, poor for some time to come. And translating that economic power into military power, it's the way we look at it traditionally. And in the Russian case, certainly you had the big decline in the economy after the end of the Cold War, and a lot of the strength of the economy after Putin came into office was because oil prices went up so high after he came into office. When Yeltsin was really struggling in 1998, oil prices were $11 a barrel. So that's hard if you're if you're reliant on energy for your economy. So, and of course the military also declined. Now, the Russian military performed quite poorly in the war with Georgia in 2008, and they went on a major drive to rebuild the military and its capacity. And we've certainly seen their operation, the way in which they've been able to operate in places like Ukraine and Syria. And they've in the missions that they've done, they've proven to be very effective. They don't have the kind of capacity the United States does. They're not a global power like the United States is. But the interesting thing is, you can look at the military. You look at the economy. And then you look at what they're doing on the information manipulation side. And, they've been able to wreak havoc on Europe. Big questions right now about Brexit and how much Brexit was affected by Russian interference. Of course, we'll live forever with 2016, right? Because you have those people who will argue that, Donald Trump had a better message and people didn't like Hillary Clinton, and that's why Donald Trump won. Doesn't matter what the Russians did. And you'll have others who will argue, it was the Russians and Jim Comey, and that's why we'll be living with that for a long time to come. But but there's no question that they've been engaged in this information manipulation. And I was talking to some folks beforehand about my visit when I was there last winter, and was talking to some folks about the whole issue of Russian election interference. And, you know, got two comments in response. One was, well, you guys do this to everyone all the time, including us, you know, and they knew I was at the NSC in 1996. You know, Clinton was trying to get Yeltsin reelected in 1996, so what are you complaining about? And the second was, oh my gosh, you know, we spent $100,000 on Facebook ads and your whole country's falling apart. And, you know, the way I view the information manipulation, a better educated population would do a better job discerning information. And we really, when we talk about that kind of information manipulation, we should really look at ourselves. And of course of course they're going to expect them to do it. So the question was, does Putin have something on Trump? You know, as soon as he uses it, then it's no good to him anymore. I mean,
he can hold it over his head.
So right, the idea is that if Putin does have something, you know, I mean, we will start to get investigations after the new Congress in January, and so I mean, my own belief, and it's only based on, you know, what I see when I look at Trump and I look at the people around him and all of that, is I could fully believe that he wanted whatever help he could get, that he wasn't really personally involved. He had people around him who were involved in trying to get stuff. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't that much. Now, whether Putin has on Trump, you know, these meetings, these hotel, whatever, I don't know, but I also have to say, I mean, have you ever seen anyone shame Donald Trump? I mean, part of me thinks if Putin has something and he says it, Trump, he's just going to keep going on, because it's not a normal response to these kinds of things that happens. And it just, you know, he attacks and he keeps attacking. And I think, you know, the Democrats, you know, anybody who's playing by normal rules is just at a complete disadvantage with him. I mean, they really are. And it's not just Democrats, it's the media. You know, let's face it, they made him. And he can complain about the fake news. He loves doing that, right? Because he knows they're doing his work for him. If you look at headlines, just look at any headline that comes through. If you're on Twitter, look at the headlines, or you know, on any kind of, you know, AP feed or something like that, and you look at the headlines, right? Trump says X. Trump says last night was a huge victory. Well, if there's nothing that follows that, then it's like, oh, well, president says it was a huge victory. I mean, the media is not equipped. Their goal, their whole way of thinking is to be balanced. They're trying to be balanced. Well, you know, all right, he says this, we're going to get somebody else who says that. Those are old rules. They don't work with him, and I mean, you know, it's very damaging to our society. My assessment of the Russian intervention in Syria. So the Russian intervention in Syria was pretty impressive in terms of their stated goals. You know, at the time the Russians went in, it looked like Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad was really in real trouble. And they saved him. So, you know, that's a big message to get out there in the world, that, hey, because, you know, they don't, you know, see if you can count on how many fingers, the number of Russian allies in the world. They don't, I mean, it's one of the great strengths, it's one of the things that troubles me the most about our current foreign policy. Our allies are a huge strength to the United States. China and Russia, I mean, they don't have allies. Russia has, you know, Assad, And, but they showed they'd stand up for him. And also remember Obama's reaction. Obama's reaction to Russia going into Syria was basically, go for it. You'll see how awful it is to get sucked into a war in the Middle East. Well, you know what? The Russians, and they largely achieved their goals. Now, the question is, you know, how do they get out? But it's not an unsustainable thing for them. And I think that they've really, I mean, they've accomplished quite a bit. Syria, of course, is destroyed. And it is a humanitarian catastrophe. But that's not really something that Putin's going to spend a lot of time worrying about. Imagine Russia after Putin. So, well, first question is, when is that going to be? Technically, his last term will end in 2024. And there are people who believe he will try to engineer a transition, and there are people who believe there's no way he's ever stepping down because he has amassed enormous assets and would, you know, how does he ensure that he keeps them and his friends and family keep what they have accrued? You know, his popularity this summer took an enormous hit because of the decision that he made on the pensions in Russia, raising the retirement age, which was announced. And I mean, you know, his approval ratings declined. You don't go after pensions. In fact, that $10.6 billion that the IMF announced in the spring of '96 during the Yeltsin re-election campaign was to help Yeltsin pay pensions, because he was so worried about how Russian voters would react if they weren't getting their pensions. So you know, we sort of assume that he's invincible and he'll last forever, but that's probably not true. And I think the closing remark I would make is that no matter who succeeds Putin, we'll see what we've seen for the last 60 years, which is, as I started my presentation, Russia wants to be seen as an equal to the United States. They will push back anytime they believe they're being disrespected, and they will look for ways to try to bring the U.S. down in some way from its position at the top of the global hierarchy. And, you know, whether that's someone who's looking a little more for accommodation, or whether that's somebody who's even more of a nationalist than Putin, I think that's going to be, it's been a common theme since Khrushchev, and I think it's going to be a common theme no matter who succeeds Putin. So, thank you.
This wasn't the first of 24 installments, but we could very well endure that, I know. Thanks very much for a marvelous evening.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate
I really
it very much.
appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
My name is